So again, welcome everyone. Today we will be covering some tips and tricks, general best practices for protocols. Kind of building on from last week, we did a protocol basics that really low level basic, getting going with a protocol, and we're going to kind of take all that was there as a foundation for today. Try to cover a variety of topics, all related to protocols, taking them further. If you were with us last week, if you are kind of a new beginner, don't feel like everything here is definitely something you need to have in your very first protocol or the protocols coming out the first season. Definitely this is kind of meant to be quick popcorn style. There's this and this and this. Ideas for you to slowly build onto from what you start out with. Having incremental improvements, I think, is much better than trying to capture all of this all in one go. And even for those that have been making protocols for some time, kind of the same rules apply. So I'll try to keep things moving and going, but definitely if there's questions, if we want to slow down on something that I get going just a little too fast, feel free to chime in on the chat to make sure that I don't go too quickly through any of it. All right, so first topic is study rules. Ideally, last week I would have done an introduction to study rules, and we just ran out of time. So just in the interest of coherency between our two sessions, I'm going to real quickly hit the high points on introducing study rules, and then we'll go deeper into kind of the best ones out there. Study rules are really a great function for really a variety of things, but the primary use for a study rule is a communication tool, really to point out the most important pieces of information, the most important entry fields for a study. That's kind of the number one goal, and that's a way for a protocol writer to define requirements of the study. And then if we put these into the protocol, that'll ensure that those requirements are all passed onto each and every trialist that is performing the trial. There are some other functions that we'll dive into today as well. Things like being able to lock down certain information that has been entered, so that way someone else cannot change it once it's been filled in. And you can even hide some information if it's confidential, and that those details shouldn't leave the company, essentially, not wanting certain people to be able to see information. So you know what? Instead of just going through this slide, probably a little more helpful if we just bring up ARM, and I have a trial here that has just a couple of study rules. I think it's a little easier to see them in action, if you will. So over here in the navigation bar, there's an editor specifically for the study rules, where you can get there from the little clipboard checkmark toolbar at the top as well. And so this gives us a list of all of the study rules. Let me just turn off my navigation bar so we can see a little more of those details of the various rules that have been added to this particular trial. And so what these rules do, hopefully if you just kind of read across the columns, it gives you somewhat of a description of what that rule is doing. So this first one is a required rule. So we are requiring that certain information get filled in. Specifically, the information we're asking for is on the site description editor. You'll find the latitude of the lower left corner. field in the General Trial tab. So we are requiring that the latitude is filled in. And the condition is tied to our trial status. So we have the ability to control when is this information required. Maybe it isn't known immediately, but will eventually be known in the trial. Or in this case, the coordinates will be known as soon as that trial is established. As soon as it's out there, it'll have a home, and that's when we can fill in the coordinates. So this condition is based on your trial status, that kind of duration throughout the trial as it proceeds through different phases. What phase of the trial does this information matter? When can it get filled in? And then if we were in an assessment or treatment, you can specify particular lines or columns where that rule would apply. And then finally, there is a permission, and that is permissions for who is able to edit this rule itself. So you'll notice in this case, as I clicked into all of these fields, I'm not actually able to edit any of this. And that is because I was not the person who created this study rule. This came from the sponsor. So we'll say this trial came from our sponsor company, and here I am as the trialist wanting to perform this trial. So there is this owner ID, and that's just a tag related to your ARM license, identifying who the individual was that created this rule. And they set it up so only people within their company, only licenses in their company would be able to edit this rule, which would make sense. So that way, as a trialist, I wouldn't just come in and delete all the rules that I don't feel like performing. Instead, we would want this locked down so that way it is a real requirement, if you will. This next rule is kind of the same idea. It's just the longitude. So here we have both latitude and longitude being required. And if I do pop over to the general trial section of the site description, there is also a visual cue. So we don't require trialists to go and scan that list of rules all the time that they're in ARM. Instead, there is a highlighting that occurs when a particular piece of information has a rule assigned to it. So here, highlighted in pink, are the requirement to fill those values in. Real quick, just to look at that third rule, it's a little bit different. It is a recommended rule. And so the difference between required and recommended is how strict it is to fill this in. How important is it to, in this case, fill in the rating date compared to filling in the coordinates? So a recommended rule will not throw an error when we go to validate and check these rules. It will just give us a warning that is less severe. So in other words, if it's marked as required, it's not valid if I don't fill it in. But a recommended is just a little softer. It'll notify the person doing that validation that, hey, we're supposed to fill in the rating date. It's a recommended rule, but it doesn't invalidate the trial. If I don't fill it in, I can still have my trial pass the validation. There's just that note to make it sure that I'm aware that it would be nice if I filled that in. So kind of two different levels, and it can be somewhat handy just depending on how important that is, or if a piece of information is usually nice to have, but there's always some exception where a particular types of trials or some locations, maybe they won't have that information. Setting the type as recommended is a nice way to just make it a little looser, so you don't have trialists coming back and say, hey, that's my trial won't pass validation because I'm required to fill this in, but I can't fill it in. So that's one way to get around those potential troubles. If you know that maybe it's not 100% of the time that can get filled in, making it recommended can just insert a little bit of flexibility in your rules. And I just wanted to point out also with this rule, slightly different condition here as well, because this is looking at your assessment column and requiring the rating date. The condition isn't tied to your trial status. Instead, it's tied to when you fill in assessment data. Let me click away from that so you can see the condition is with assessment data. So you might have 20 assessment column headers filled in and 20 assessments planned. Only once data is entered in a particular column will the requirement for the rating date kick in. So just trying to make it smarter. Of course, if I've got all of these different assessments planned, when I first start out, I can't possibly do the rating date for all of those yet because I haven't performed them yet. So it just making the condition just kind of makes the rule a little smarter. So you can have control over when it kicks in. So it's not just inundating the trial list with errors constantly type of thing. All right, so that hopefully gives us just a real quick rundown. We kind of covered all of those components there. Going back to ARM here for a brief minute, these rules were already added. I can certainly add a new one from this screen if I wish. To do that, if I was going to add we'll say a site description rule, I would click on that tab and then click New. And that would create a new row in this table for a site description rule. And there we go. If I choose whatever field I'm interested in, maybe I want to require the address. Then once I choose that field, I have the type, and I can go along and kind of fill in all of those details. Little slow. It is definitely possible to do that. Kind of the best way that I think to create rules is simply to go through the different sections of a trial. And whenever you have something you want to get filled in, maybe I'll say the climate zone is the next one, just right click on that field. And at the bottom of the right click menu are study rule related functions. Specifically, required will add a required rule. And the drop down here has all the different conditions that I can choose from. So when do I want to require the climate zone? I can have it required always or tie it to a particular status. In this case, kind of the same thing as the coordinates. That should be known as soon as the trial is set to establish because we know where it's at then. So even though this was filled in, so you'll notice it didn't get highlighted because that value's already been filled in. It still created the rule here in the editor. And so the reason to do that, number one, it's just kind of easier visually, I think, to step through all of the sections of a trial. Number one, you can see on the screen what is there, what are the options, what should get filled in. Easy to right click and just add a bunch of rules, as opposed to, you kind of saw how slow going it was to make one on our own. Really, really nice and quick. Building in that list here, once you've created all the rules that are of interest, we can save this list to a file. And that'll let us use it on all of our other protocols and or trials that we have. And so that's the real advantage, is to go through a trial, maybe last year's trial. You kind of can remember some of the hiccups, things I had to ask the trialist for. If I'm a sponsor planning out my next year's protocol, what are things that we need to make sure get filled in? What are things that people forget to fill in? Things like that. you can go through a trial and create a list in that particular file, and then we can save a set, and we call it a rule set. And that's really the list of all of the rules that we have in this one study. And that way we can, replicate that list in any other file. So if I save set, it just has this particular RLS is the file extension type. Not that matters too much to us. And it'll just save it on our computer, much like other sets that we create in ARM. And maybe we'll call this our protocol advanced today, or whatever we'd want to call it. Best trick is to name this something that means something to you, maybe what the target is. In this case, it's maybe my baseline. It's my baseline rules for all studies. Whatever your goal, whatever you think of for this list, give it a name that will remind you of what that is. It makes it much easier to select from the list in the future. There is also a description. So after you've chosen a file name, you can be more verbose if you want. So I'm going to say use it for all of them. If I'm pretending that I'm the sponsor, I'll just say that, hey, we need to use this for everything that we send out to our trialists or whatever. And that little description can be visible if you're loading a rule set. So just real briefly, if I were to be in a protocol now, so I'll just create a new protocol. Then I can, and you could do this in a separate trial as well, but just in the study rules, you go ahead and load that set. And there's my file, and you can see that's the description here to remind myself of what the purpose was. And now that list comes in to this file as well. So that's a rule set. Really makes rules kind of worth it, if you will, of being able to replicate and use that same list. So of course that brings standardization, that you may want the same list or more or less the same list in all of your studies. It also makes it a lot faster to get going and add all of those all in one go. A tip on study rules, you don't have to make one that would cover everything. You can actually load more than one rule set at a time. And they are, when they come in, each rule is added to the study incrementally, and they are additive. So ARM will check to make sure that there isn't already a rule in place, so you don't end up breaking the study, or you end up accidentally having two rules that contradict each other or something like that. So the example here is if I already had loaded in a set where it was requiring the GPS coordinate, and then I add a second set, and that happens to have the same field, that GPS, but it's only recommended. It's not going to break. It's not going to create an infinite loop. We won't get error messages. ARM just doesn't add the recommended because there's already one more strict in place. So you'll see in the end, it's just required, no harm, no foul. So you can craft different sets for different purposes without worry of breaking things if you put in the wrong combination of sets or something like that. So I kind of touched on some of these already, but just to compile up tricks for rules and rule sets. Like I said, go through last year's trial. That's a great way of just remembering hiccups, remembering things that needed to be asked for. Adding a rule this year then can eliminate some of those extra emails of asking for that piece of information from different trials. Put that into next year's protocol, so that way the trialist sees that information is needed. You can build those layers of sets. So the example I gave was that master set of, I'll just go through and every single study that we ever do, there's maybe this core information that we would need. And then maybe I'd make another pass and say, okay, so for our herbicide studies, maybe there's a different, there's these other things that are needed, which is probably a different list than something we're doing in the greenhouse. Or, on our biostimulant studies, there's kind of a whole different set of things that matter. And so you can build sets and give them names for each discipline or whatever, however else you'd want to organize it. And create these different sets. We touched on the recommended, how that can be simple. Overall, in general, you don't have to go out and make 200 rules all in the first go. Sometimes just starting simple with a few, and then each year just kind of iterate and build from that as you see what works and what doesn't. That's a great way to do it. And if you've got a group of people, maybe you have a whole set of protocol writers, a group of people that do that, sitting down together and making these sets can be real powerful to just have that group think of everyone can bring up those little gotchas and things that trip people up, encapsulate those all into your standard sets, so then everyone has that good core knowledge, if you will. And all of this, of course, today our goal is protocols, but if you're in the middle of the season and think, oh, that sounds so great, I really wish I did this in a protocol, you can do all of this in a trial as well. Create that rule set and just manually insert it into your trials, even as you're getting data back. Obviously, next year, it works great to have it in the protocol, so it's in all the trials from the get-go, but there's nothing wrong with making a set and just adding it when you get data back. So that's a quick rundown on study rules, kind of in general. I do want to kind of highlight maybe the top study rules, maybe for functionality. Some things, a little bit of it is advertising of ones that maybe go unnoticed, and they add really a lot of functionality or really nice for standardization, but they might not jump out on the screen so much. So trying to bring awareness to some of these that really are pretty powerful. So number 5 is conditional rules. So we were just showing how that condition column, it oftentimes is kind of tied to your trial status. You can actually customize that. So instead of having to use the trial status, you could use any other field in the trial as the basis for when a study rule gets kicked in, gets turned on. And that's what we call a conditional rule. So on the editor there, typically always is selected there related to the condition that you put in. But if you toggle that to a conditional, then there's a separate editor where you can build in this condition statement, this logic for when does that rule kick in. So the example on the screen here, I'm wanting to require the planting rate field that's in the crop description. I want that filled in, but obviously there's no way to know the planting rate until the crop has actually been planted. So I create this conditional to require the planting rate, but only when the planting date field is not equal to blank. Essentially, I don't want to specify a specific date. I don't know what date it will be. I just want it to trigger whenever the planting date is not empty. Then I know a planting date has been filled in, and thus presumably the crop has been planted. So now I need that rate filled in. So this drop down here is really any field in the site description you can use as the trigger point for the study rule that you have. Oops. So this is a great way, going back to that idea of creating a master rule set. You can really flesh that out even more with these conditional rules. So you wouldn't have to create all these different sets. You can make that global rule set have even more rules. And just particular rules really only apply for certain trial types. You could use the conditional for your discipline field. So that way, although the rule is in every single trial, it never gets turned on unless the trial has been marked as a biostimulant study. Then we'll require that information. So you can grow that global rule set without having it kick in for different trial types by just building in that conditional. Next study rule is the ability to lock a field and prevent a value from changing when it's been filled in. So this might be real handy if you have something you're putting in the protocol that should not get changed. This is kind of for my company. If I'm the sponsor, these are details we need documented about the study. It's not going to change. It's not something the trialist is involved with or would need to change. You can lock that field so it cannot be edited. Just a little word of caution for locking it. If there is any potential for wanting someone else to change that value, that's where using that recommended rule instead of requiring might be the way to go. That way, if there's just the gotcha, something weird happened, it's not impossible for someone else to change that value. So if you change it to recommended, then this is what the trialist would see if they tried to change that value. So they would be warned, hey, you shouldn't change this. It's been marked to not change it. So you should only do this if you absolutely have to. The alternative, if you are in a situation where you've required it and they need to change it, really the only way is the trialist would send it back to you, the protocol owner, and then the protocol owner can remove that rule and send the trial back. So it is possible just by removing the rule, but it just creates that extra work, extra communication in those odd cases. Next study rule is consistent entries. And there's really kind of two different flavors to this one. The goal here is kind of twofold. You can autofill. Kind of the first action that happens is that a particular field is autofilled automatically across multiple assessment columns that are all tied together. So you can choose either based on the SE or the rating timing field, either one of those. In this case, I've got consistent entries across rating timing. So I've got these 4 assessments that are all done on the same day. They're all the same rating timing. So I've put them in as A5, the 5th assessment in the schedule. So they're all done on the same day. And in this case, they're yield. So naturally, they're all together all on the same day. Then I've chosen the rating date as the field that I want to be consistent across that rating timing. And so as a result, here's a little video. When I fill in the rating date for one of those columns, then because this rule is in place, that date gets filled in all the way across there. And I'll let this play one more time just to show you've got that same rating timing. Since they're all in the rating timing, we want whichever field we've chosen, in this case, the rating date, those should all be the same. So my requirement is if the rating timing has the same code, it needs to have the same date, just logically speaking. And so using this rule, it's a shortcut, number one, that it's really fast. Now, once I fill in the rating date for the first column, the rest of them all get filled in. And then it's also a nice cross check. So coming, from a different direction, if someone were to come in and try to change the date on column 11, for example, later on, there would be this warning, that same warning here to say, wait a minute, I didn't want to go. I wanted that to pause. Oh, well, it would say, wait a minute, there's this rule that says the date needs to be consistent across all columns that have the same rating timing. So saves a little time filling it in, but also maintains that consistency. And in this case, I chose the rating date. That was the field that I made the rule for, but you could make it for really any other field in the assessment section as well. And this was showing the rating timing as that grouping functionality. There's also a rule, consistent entries across SE name. I believe it's the SE name. And so if you've created an SE, so you have the multiple columns in a single SE, you can require that certain information is the same in each of those columns. All right, study rule number 2 to demonstrate is strict validation. So this rule will require that the validation list is used to fill in the field of choice. So basically, we're restricting and preventing the ability to free type in a field that we're choosing. So in this case, I've got the part rated, rating type, rating unit. Those all have to come from the list. I don't want somebody hand typing something in. So on the screen there, you can see if I click into that field, even if I just try typing on my keyboard, the list automatically pops up. The box itself does not allow for typing. As soon as I type, the list just comes up to say, hey, there is no typing here. You need to choose from the list. So that's a way. Maybe I don't have every assessment formalized into an SE, but I do want to make sure that if they're filling in an assessment, I do not want things hand typed. I want to make sure that they're at least choosing from ARM's list. A great way to just standardize it. And this is just on the assessment data, but there's a lot of other fields in the site description and other spots that have the same capability of just preventing hand typing in a certain field. Last but definitely not least, actually we're calling it number 1, just for the consistency that it can bring. The rule itself is called limit validation list, but what it accomplishes is it really creates a link between your assessment data header when you're defining a crop or a pest in your assessment. It requires a link to the site description where you have filled in the crop or the pest codes. So you'll see when you add this rule, which is either called limit validation list if you're doing the rule ID. Otherwise, now that we have this interface, It's a predefined study rule on the assessment data section of the rule editor to limit assessment crop and pest list to items selected in the site description. And when that gets turned on, there's one more field, this pest, your pest code or the crop code has one more field, and it's the ID number. And so when you go to fill in the pest or go to fill in the crop, the list that comes up is not the full list from EPO of all of the pests or all the crops. Instead, it's only the ones that are in this specific trial in the pest description or in the crop description. So this is really powerful for consistency, making sure that the right codes are entered. Someone didn't pick a slightly off, not quite the right code in the assessment section when I've filled in the right one in the site description, and it saves them time as well. So from the trialist standpoint, it's a benefit too. I'm not sorting through all of the pests. I've got just a nice simple list of the ones that have already been defined for this study. And if they don't find what they need, in this case, oh, there's one more weed that we didn't anticipate being here, you can just click on the new button and that'll just take the person right to the pest description and creates a new repeating section. And there they can define this new pest that hasn't been used or hasn't been documented yet. And then they can come back to the assessment and choose that from the list and proceed on with the assessment. So it's just a real powerful way to really cement that together. All right, so that kind of concludes our study rules. Of course, we don't go very far from rules because now we're into validation and some general tricks and tips here. So more generally for filling in protocol, try to get moving a little faster here as well. So in a protocol, there's certain value unit pairs. So, in ARM, a lot of spots where you have a value that gets filled in and then you document the unit. If you're in a protocol, a lot of these fields do not have a requirement if you fill in the unit, but without a value. Because the idea here is we want the ability in a protocol to instruct the trialist what unit you want that to be documented in. So here I'm wanting to say that crop density, please record it in square meters and please put the pest as a %. If you did this in a trial, there would be an error message says, hey, wait a minute, you've got a unit, but you don't have a value. And so you'd have these validation errors. We don't want that in a protocol. So that's the capability here, is that we've really removed those types of errors. So that way you can put in information in the protocol. So the byproduct of that, and why I really want to point that out, is if you do fill something in here, then you put in a study rule to require those values. Because when you create the trial, it's not going to have those validation errors. We've kind of removed them because it was more harmful, and we want that ability to instruct. So use a study rule then to say, hey, that value of the crop density, I want you to fill that in once there's data. And that gives you control anyway of when it should get filled in. So the goal is more opportunities in the protocol to put in information, which is kind of ties in directly with this functionality as well, the review protocol entries wizard, if you will, I guess. So this was something we added a couple years ago for that very same purpose of allowing protocol writers to put in as much information as you'd want in a protocol without the fear of it going unnoticed in the trial. Because the fundamental difference in a protocol, you're putting in instructions, you're putting in the plan, and if that gets copied into the trial, everything in a trial is maybe assumed to be documentation of what actually happened. And so the goal here is that the information put in the protocol is tracked. ARM tracks if it never gets touched, if whatever is in the protocol is never changed, never altered throughout the course of the trial, then here on this review dialog, we highlight that information. So that way the trialist can real quickly review to ensure that these were originally put in as instructions. Let's make sure that those still are true. It wasn't just overlooked and didn't get updated. So this happens in trial validation. It's not something you need to turn on or can get turned off. It is just part of ARM's validation that occurs. You can also, there's a specific menu command if you want to perform that review at any point in time, you can do that separately as well. And again, the goal is just to hopefully, bolster and enable protocol writers to put in anything and don't, without that fear of, losing accuracy in the trial. Because some feedback that we had heard is, well, if I put too much in the protocol, how do I know the trialist saw it? How do I know that it's not accidentally going to get passed on as documentation of what happened without the trialist being aware it was there? Now we can be sure because in order for the trialist to pass validation, they have to go through each screen and view that and confirm it. And so this is just showing real quick, little bits of it happen throughout the study as you mark an assessment. When you put in a rating date or an application date, then fields in that application or that column get included when you validate. And so they just see right on the screen, there's highlighting all this information that was originally entered, which in this case, not super practical, probably that you would put in the stage information. You might want to have some of that there as to when the application should occur, but now we definitely want to make sure the trialist sees that that information is actually when it occurred. And then the same thing for the assessment columns, those header details that we filled in, and they have to choose each one that I reviewed that has to be confirmed that that information highlighted is true. Next one here, we saw this with the assessment rules. I do just want to point out that if you have a study rule related to an application, you have an option when you're defining that rule to require it with the application date. So just like in the assessment, where the rule only kicks in once the date has been or in that case, once data has been entered in an application, as soon as the application date is filled in, that's the trigger that, oh, this application must have occurred. Now this information needs to be filled in. I want this documented when the application is performed. And the only time that a rule like that won't be required is if the application does not occur. So kind of tied to that is this ability, if for some reason a planned application is not applied, you can still keep that application code. So you know that the plan was there was going to be 3, but in this particular trial, only 2 were performed. Turning on that NA to say this is not applied, that you can see grays out that application, and any rules that you had aren't going to be flagged, because obviously we've demonstrated that the application couldn't be performed. So those two kind of go hand in hand on documenting application details. This validation here, somewhat related to the limit validation list we saw earlier, just trying to cross-reference the crops or the pests that you have put in the trial, making sure they are referenced somewhere else in the study. Specifically, either the stage at application or in an assessment column. And if neither of those locations ever reference those codes or something gets filled in there, then there'll be this warning. And it won't be an error, but just a warning to notify that it wasn't, there was no data associated with that crop or with that pest. So again, another effort to encourage more information to be put in the protocol. You know, one example would be you have a study and maybe there's 8 different pests. Depends on the location, which ones they'll actually encounter, but there's kind of 8 targets that we have. I can put all 8 of those as separate codes in my protocol, and it'll be easy to spot when we get trials back. There'll be this warning to show us which ones were never documented. And a nice cross reference for that trial is to see, oh, wait a minute, that particular code we saw out there. I need to make sure that I filled things in correctly because we did see it. Or no, that's perfect because we never did encounter that one. Again, this one is also just basic validation function. There's no specific rule that you need to put in place. And a general trick for validation in general, especially as a sponsor, if you're receiving trials back, use the log errors option for validation. And that will go through the entire trial and create a list of all of the errors that come up. When you do the regular check mark, ARM stops at the first problem and tries to bring you to it for it to be corrected. But maybe if you're not the one that would actually do the correcting, because that should be the trialist's job, the log errors gives you a nice rundown of, hey, these are the things that aren't right. And there's a clipboard button, so that'll actually copy that list, and you can just paste it right into a email to send back to the trialist to say, hey, these pieces of information I still need. Can you please send me an updated trial? Okay, so that is a variety of validation options. One more thing here on protocols, kind of related to planning out your trial locations. This was something new in last year's version, but I want to highlight here the trial location table that is in your trial establishment guidelines in a protocol. This table is a great way to plan out all the different trial locations that this study is going to go out to. And you can kind of pre-fill trial IDs. You can put down the names of your CROs who's responsible for those studies. You can even have multiple trials marked down if individuals will have multiple different locations, things, trials that they will need to create. The one downside, though, to that table was if you send that protocol out to each trialist so that way they can create their own trial, it was maybe not the greatest that everyone can see who all else is working on this experiment. So what we added is a couple of fields that allow you to limit what information from this table individuals can see. So by filling in either a license GDM ID or the company ID for a group, and that's all information related to an ARM license. If you fill in either one of those columns, then ARM can filter that table when a trialist opens up the protocol. So for example, I've got just a bunch of made up IDs and made up companies, but let's say company 1, I have an individual from there, and you'll notice that they have this first and the last trial are both assigned to them, but the 3 in the middle are not. Since I filled all of this in, when I send this protocol to the trial list that's in company 1, this is all they see. ARM hides from them any row that doesn't connect up to their company ID or their GDM ID. So that's a nice way to still get to use this table, plan everything out, without giving out too much information. That's really not necessary. You know, for this trial list in company 1, it matters not whatsoever any other studies that are happening in this experiment. I only need to see the ones that are assigned to them, and that's what they see now, and they don't have to see all those others. If you want to take advantage of that functionality, probably don't know offhand, or I don't know too many people that have memorized their GDM ID or company ID. It's just a fictitious identifier for licenses. All you'd have to do is request that the trialist send their license details. And all they would have to do is under the help menu, open up their profile, and right there on their profile, there's a button to send license details. And that'll just generate an email that fills in all of the license identifiers that you would need, and they just send that to you. And now you've got that information. So you can, if I go back, fill in either company ID or the GDM ID. Either one, ARM filters based on the company. So if you fill in GDM IDs, ARM behind the scenes just looks up the company ID of that individual person and filters based on company. In either case, we just wanted it flexible. So that's hopefully a nice improvement to the ability to plan out the different trial locations. All right, that's the end of my slides. We covered quite a bit of assessment and site description, but I did have one other note on the treatments, since I do have just another minute or two. I guess just didn't end up in my slides. On the treatments editor, probably the one rule validation trick that I'd want to point out is related to that confidential information we mentioned way back at the beginning today. I'm guessing this is probably the most common spot where there would be confidential information that, as a sponsor, I would want to have documented in my trials, but that I might not want the trialist to know or to be able to see. I think treatments is the most common one there. And maybe even the treatment name might be the trigger, if that's the case, or maybe it's ingredient information, something like that. I don't want them to know, but I do kind of need in my trials. That's where a hidden field study rule can be useful. But one thing I do like to note, especially related to that treatment name, is the treatment name field is used kind of a lot. That's the way to identify, to call a treatment what it is. And so if you've got confidential information, my recommendation is not to put that as your treatment name, but maybe you would just use a coded name instead. And then that confidential stuff you wouldn't want others to see. There is a description column that's just wide open in the sense, free text, whatever you would want to put in there. That might be the place to put in the confidential information. Then in the description, I can right click and make a hidden field study rule. And the options are, who do I want to hide this information from? So if anyone else besides me, that my license, anyone else tries to open this study, they won't see this description. Probably the recommended, the safest bet is to use, if not in my company. Presumably, anyone from my company can see that information. It's when the trial goes somewhere else that I would want to protect this information. And the other trick, the trouble with a hidden field is I have the permission to view it. So nothing changes on the screen here, although I do have that study rule present. We are hiding that description if I open this from someone other than my company. Problem is, it's really hard to know what if it's actually doing something. So if you're not totally sure and you want to test it, you could certainly send a study to me and I'll open it with my license and just send your screenshot to say, hey, this is what someone else would see if you want to test it. I'm just going to save it here on my computer and then log in with a different license. Let me double check. I am under me at the moment, but I close my ARM and I'm going to open up that protocol that I just created, but I'll use my testing license instead real quick, just to show what actually happens. Oops. And, oh, my screen is just not refreshing for some reason. There we go. So this is simulating someone else opening it, sending it to the trialist. Now I am someone else. I am not the person who created it. And what you'll find is there is no description. And if I go to my hidden fields, show me everything. Still no description. Same thing in the print. I can't print a report and try to make that description show up. There is no way that I can view that information. It is hidden from me. Me being someone besides that person defined in the study rules. So there, that rule is locked, and only somebody who is from Matt's company can view that. All right, well, that filled in the time. If you do have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us. Tricks, tips for trying to get your protocols in tip-top shape. I appreciate everyone's time joining us today. As I said, we'll be sending out notification here soon when we're ready for the next round of webinars that'll start up in April again. So thanks again, everyone.